Hello everyone, my name is Rosey Gutierrez, and today I will be talking about algorithmic bias and the different types of impact it has on society and the underprivileged. Unconscious and implicit biases come with the territory of being human, and those biases get inadvertently embedded in the technology that we create. One of the main points to be addressed is that as a society, we are conditioned to think of mathematics and computers as objective neutral entities incapable of bias. Unfortunately, this is a huge misconception and also serves as a shroud for tech companies to hide behind in order to avoid accountability. The impact of algorithmic bias is already self-evident and continues to affect society on a daily basis with varying degrees of harm, ranging from inconvenience to the normalization of discrimination and loss of opportunity. In order to address some of these issues, we will take a look at the underlying causes of rampant bias, as well as ways to mitigate and even prevent harm going forward, and why these solutions cannot be left up to tech companies. An algorithm is simply a set of instructions on how to process data in order to get desired outputs from given inputs. While this may sound harmless in theory, the fact of the matter is that when certain conditions in the rules are not accounted for, it can cause the algorithm to output unexpected results. Some of these instructions reflect a very narrow worldview because the primary architects of these algorithms are disproportionately of a single demographic. This can result in unexpected consequences for those outside that demographic, even if harm was never really intended in the first place. This is a very basic model that researchers use to map the debate behind the ethics of widespread use of algorithmic tech. The Epistemic Concerns detail the root of algorithmic decision-making, which uses data that may not always be reflective of all users, but yet said data is used to make decisions about them on a daily basis. This leads to larger normative concerns, where said decision-making creates unfair outcomes for those misrepresented in the datasets due to the implicit biases embedded in the algorithms. This further exacerbates negative perceptions and misconceptions. Finally, the nature of algorithms as tools for rapid data processing compounded with their swift distribution among tech makers make it incredibly difficult to pinpoint the source of discriminatory behavior, thus making it near impossible to determine who should be held accountable for the harm caused. So moving into some examples of harm caused by algorithmic technology, this is an example of bias just found in everyday applications, your search engine. Author Sophia Omoyo-Noble has several other disturbing examples within her book, and this is only one example out of many that I was able to replicate. Googling black girls yields pornographic results. Black teenagers yields mugshots. And even searching terms like gorillas will return images of black individuals. Conversely, Googling unspecified terms like man, woman, and teenager will yield normal pictures of happy white people. It used to be that predictions used to return extremely racist rhetoric as well, but Google has thankfully since implemented a report feature for inappropriate predictions. However, as you can see, image search results still contain an enormous amount of bias. This quote by MIT grad student and founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, Joy Bolamwini, really puts AI and algorithms into perspective. She was one of the researchers behind a study which found bias within facial recognition software from companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, Kairos, and Face++. At the time of this study, Amazon was selling their facial recognition technology to law enforcement despite the high margin of error in non-white females. The issue finally got some attention once the software was run on members of Congress. The software misidentified nearly every non-white congressman. Ms. Wollomwini found that the reason for this huge margin of error was that the datasets used to train this facial recognition algorithms were so disproportionately white and male that the software had trouble identifying anything else accurately. One of the biggest issues with facial recognition lies in the negative feedback loop that it tends to create. As individuals get detained due to misidentification, the data will show that individual as having been detained before, thus increasing their chances of being detained in the future, even if the first instance was baseless. This increases over-policing in underprivileged communities. In a study by Straw and Callison-Birch, biases were found in an AI used to diagnose patients. The data used to train the AI was riddled with discriminatory practices, and that translated into the AI operations. The study found that the AI dismissed pain in women and people of color, and in side-by-side comparisons, diagnosed women with bipolar disorder, while men with the exact same symptoms were diagnosed with PTSD. The AI developed some of the same biases currently present in the healthcare industry, only now those biases are the norm thanks to the widespread use of the AI. This is one of many ways of how algorithmic bias normalizes harm and threatens the health and safety of underprivileged groups. A precedent-setting victory was won when a group of teachers banded together to challenge the educational value-added assessment system, a proprietary algorithm model which determined that historically well-performing teachers were underperforming and not bringing value to the school, which ultimately threatened their employ despite all previous tangible evidence of excellence. No one was able to ascertain the reason behind the algorithm's decision-making, thus ruling it unconstitutional as a 14th Amendment violation. Despite this precedent and the victory, similar dubious algorithmic models are still used to this day to arbitrarily assess people's competency or hiring potential. As we've seen from a few examples, algorithms have some deeply disturbing underlying issues. They cannot be taken as objective truth, since an algorithm is a formula for a desired result by a programmer. The definition of a desired output is completely up to the programmer. But as we discussed before, even if an algorithm is designed with a specific output in mind, it is possible that the instructions will be interpreted in a way that the programmer was not expecting, simply because it made sense given the inputs provided. The nature of the fast-paced data processing reinforces the anomalies, and it becomes incredibly hard to debug even for the programmers themselves. So given the research, I believe that there are 3 very significant underlying causes causing rampant algorithmic bias. First, a lack of diversity in engineer groups, which then leads to instructional blind spots within the algorithms. As we've seen, the technology works predominantly on a very small demographic of the population who also happens to be the primary demographic of those engineering it. Second, tech companies who are unwilling to address issues within their own systems and instead opt to try to discredit or retaliate against those who point out the flaws in their software. When Ms. Wollomwini first published her research along Dr. Gabru in regards to the alarming bias found in facial recognition, Amazon immediately attempted to discredit their work. Third, a complete lack of accountability. As Dr. Kathy O'Neill pointed out in Weapons of Math Destruction, those who own the code essentially have all the power over those that they deploy it against. Given the aforementioned issue with tech companies being incapable of addressing their technology in good faith, a federal regulation agency specializing in algorithmic technology should be established in order to ensure some sort of accountability going forward. The latest executive summary from the United States Equal Opportunity and Employment Commission shows an abysmal percentage of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in tech. Women are also extremely underrepresented at 23.8% overall in engineering positions. This disparity becomes even greater once the intersection of race and gender is taken into account. It is not hard to see why technologies like facial recognition affected women of color so prominently given this data. Note that people of different gender expression are completely unaccounted for. During the facial recognition technology impact on our civil rights and liberties congressional hearing, Ms. Buolamwini noted that facial recognition actually excludes people of alternative gender expression, which once again correlates with the representation data being shown here. The incident that made me lose all faith in tech companies' ability to hold themselves accountable was Dr. Gebru's termination from the Google AI ethics team after concerns of bias in language models were rug swept. Frustrated, she emailed her team and told them that it was futile to continue to work and conduct painstaking research if it was going to be dismissed anyway. In her email, she wrote, and I quote, "Your life starts getting worse when you start advocating for underrepresented people. You start making other leaders upset. There is no way more documents or more conversations will achieve anything," unquote. For this, she was locked out of her accounts, and Jeff Dean then released a statement saying they had accepted her resignation, an attempt at gaslighting and discrediting Dr. Gebru. Dr. Mitchell, Gebru's co-lead, then released an open letter criticizing Gebru's abrupt firing, garnering thousands of signatures from other Googlers and engineers. Dr. Mitchell was fired shortly after that as well. To me, these events are a testament that tech companies do not have the public's best interest and will ultimately disregard issues of bias regardless of what they may otherwise say. To conclude, Dr. Kathy O'Neill has mentioned a proposal for a federal agency dedicated to regulating algorithms, much like the FDA is responsible for curating food and drugs to ensure that they are safe for consumption. This is a rough example of what I personally believe that a pipeline should look like before any algorithmic technology is deployed to the public. I also believe that a person's digital footprint should be protected as medical records are protected by HIPAA in order to reduce the harm that comes from data mining and unethically collecting biometric information. Here are my sources in MLA format, and that concludes my presentation. I want to thank Dr. Pamela Perry for her amazing support throughout the semester up until now. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.